and I'm the illustrator of The Orange Tree and Other Stories, a book of short stories for children. And today I'm going to read you one of the stories, and it's called The Great Tree. Once upon a time, in a faraway land, there was a forest of tall trees. But there was one tree that was taller than the rest. This was the Great Tree. The Great Tree was the first tree in the morning to see the sun rise, and the last tree at night to see the sun set. And because it stood in the centre of the forest, all paths and tracks began from the Great Tree, and all the paths and the tracks in the forest led to it. Everyone knew the Great Tree. All the animals in the forest knew the Great Tree. They played and sheltered under its canopy of leaves, and when danger threatened, they climbed its huge trunk and hid in its branches. Fairies made magic circles round the Great Tree and danced beneath its branches. Birds built their nests in the Great Tree, and nightingales sang their songs from the topmost branches of the Great Tree. The Great Tree was the centre of the forest. Most trees would have been happy to be as tall as the Great Tree, but the Great Tree was not happy. It told the birds to fly over the forest and tell him if there were any other trees as tall as he was. But when they returned and told him that he was the tallest tree in the forest, the Great Tree was still not happy. The Great Tree wanted to be the tallest tree in all the world. Winter came to the forest, bringing storm clouds and thunder. The Great Tree had lived through many winters and passed through many storms. It took no notice of the driving wind and flashes of lightning. While the animals and fairies huddled in fear, the Great Tree stood proud against the wind and the rain. The rain rocked the smaller trees from side to side. But one night the storm did not pass on, but broke with a clap of thunder over the Great Tree. Jagged shafts of lightning shot across the sky. But still the Great Tree ignored the storm. It stood upright, not yielding or bending like the smaller trees, but defiant against the wind and rain. At the height of the storm, a great bolt of lightning flashed through the sky and struck the Great Tree. There was an ear-splintering crack, and the Great Tree split in two. At the same time, a blossoming blue fire enveloped the trunk of the Great Tree, and shimmering rings of blue and purple flame ran up and down its branches. A sheet of orange flame wrapped itself around the Great Tree, turning it into a pillar of fire. When the flames finally died, all that remained of the Great Tree was a hollow stump, blackened and burnt. The morning after the storm, the fairies and the animals picked their way through the forest to the Great Tree. They had heard the thunder and the terrible crack and knew that something dreadful had happened. But neither the fairies nor the animals were prepared for what they saw. They stood in silence around the trunk of the Great Tree, shaking their heads in disbelief. The Great Tree had been burnt to the ground. All that remained was a blackened stump. It is a fact of life that those who are not really great, but only think they are great, are soon forgotten. And so it was with the Great Tree. The fairies soon found another tree to sing and dance around. The squirrels played happily on the other trees, and the nightingales sang their songs from the other treetops. Uncared for and forgotten, the Great Tree became overgrown with weeds and was lost from sight. But the Great Tree had not died. Although it had been burned to the ground, its roots were alive. Left to itself, the Great Tree had plenty of time to think about its life. It remembered thinking how great he was and wanting to be the tallest tree in the forest, and how quickly that greatness was taken from him. It had not been so proud and headstrong, he might have survived the storm, and if he had not thought himself so high and mighty, he might not have been so quickly forgotten. Each spring, a few green shoots appeared on the trunk of the great tree. Given time, they would grow into branches, and the branches bear leaves and give shade to the animals that lived in the forest. This time, the great tree would not live for himself, or think only of becoming the tallest tree in the world. Its branches would become a home for nesting birds, its foliage making a rustling sound in the wind. And although he would never be a tall tree again, he hoped that the nightingales would return. The great tree missed listening to their songs and hearing the sound of their voices. As the years passed, the shoots grew into branches, and the fairies, seeing that the great tree was alive, cleared the weeds that had grown up around the burnt-out stump. Birds began to nest in the great tree, and squirrels to hide their nuts in its trunk. For the first time since the night of the storm, the great tree felt happy. He was part of the life of the forest again. With each passing year, the great tree felt more at home in the forest. Autumn gave way to winter, winter to spring, and spring to summer. The years passed by, and the great tree was content to live its life among other trees in the forest without any claims to greatness. But then, one summer, disaster struck the forest. There had been little rain, and the grass had become as dry as straw. A spark from a campfire started a blaze that quickly got out of control. Sheets of flames, fanned by the wind, spread in every direction. The fire raced through the forest, filling the animals with panic. They ran blindly through the smoke, this way and that, trying to escape the flames. But there was nowhere to run. There was no river or stream to run to, or cave to hide in. Fire surrounded them on all sides. Then the fairies remembered the great tree. The great tree! They cried, "Run to the great tree!" The animals followed the fairies to the great tree, jumping after them into the hollow of its trunk. They were just in time. As the last squirrel scrambled in, a sheet of orange flame swept over them, showering the animals in sparks. The fire raged all around the great tree, but it did not catch fire. Because the stump of the tree was charred, there was nothing for the flames to burn. The fire passed over them. The great tree had saved their lives. When the fire died down, the animals and fairies climbed out of the great tree. All the trees in the forest looked like blackboard cutouts. There was not a green leaf to be seen. The great tree had saved their lives, but this time it had not survived. Flames had burnt its young branches, and the heat of the fire had killed its roots. The great tree was dead. Its life in the forest was over. But the fairies kept the memory of the great tree alive. They told their children about the great tree, and their children passed on the story to their children. The great tree will not be forgotten, because tales of sacrifice live on in stories and song. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story from the orange tree. If you'd like to read more stories, further copies are available from Amazon or my website. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.